You know, I've lived in 3 different states, and yet I've always lived near Interstate 75, and that's not entirely weird. Many people move multiple times but remain close to the same interstate, only a different exit. And that's because interstates are the modern rivers that take us where we want to visit or live. We started building interstates as we know them today over 50 years ago, and they've changed the way we live. In our age, we often talk about computers changing everything. Every day we hear about autonomous driving, cars that will drive themselves. And this isn't futuristic hype. It's happening, and it's happening right now. We often hear about our ability to access information at or close to the speed of light, and how computer technology, thanks to Moore's Law, is changing humanity. But the truth is that none of this would matter if not for interstates. While computers may connect our minds across the planet, interstates connect humanity across continents in the real world. There is nothing virtual about interstates. In today's society, you can pretty much order everything you need online and never leave your home. But you're ordering from someplace else, and most of the time, that someplace else can be several states away. And it's our interstate system that allows affordable shipping and travel across the country and even the world. Yes, we use trains too, and don't forget airplanes, but without interstates, the cost of shipping and travel would be enormous and reserved only for the elite or travel enthusiast. But in our society, we don't even consider a 500 to 700 mile trip to be a super long trip anymore. Interstates change the distances we commute from our jobs, churches, and even schools. And the ability for the average person to travel great distances influences our culture.
When I was a kid and even a teenager, and I'm 43 now, so you're going back 25 plus years. But a kid, maybe 15, 16 years old, there were times of the day or night where you would go through stretches of I-75 and it would feel like you and maybe 1 or 2 other cars were the only cars on the road, or maybe a truck or 2. Especially at night, 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning if you're on I-75 crossing Jellicoe Mountain. Back in the day, 25 years ago, you would see a truck, or 2 or 3 trucks, but you almost had the road to yourself. That's not the case anymore. I-75 from Miami all the way up to the northern upper peninsula of Michigan stays busy 24 hours a day.
So let's take care of some basic information about I-75 that you may have known and forgotten or didn't know at all. Interstate 75, or I-75, is a major north-south transcontinental route that runs from Miami, Florida to Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan. I-75 runs through 6 different states that include Florida, Georgia, Tennessee, Kentucky, Ohio, and Michigan. Believe it or not, half of I-75 runs through only 2 states, Michigan and Florida. Originally, this wasn't supposed to be the case, as I-75 was supposed to end at Tampa Bay, but the population of Southwest Florida boomed, and so I-75 was extended all the way to Miami, Florida. The northern end of I-75 runs all the way through the state of Michigan, including the Upper Peninsula, or the UP, all the way to the Canadian border at the International Bridge. It's logical to ask how interstates are numbered, and what makes an interstate an interstate. Granted, this video is not meant to be a lesson in interstate development, but you have to know just a few things about interstates in order to appreciate the main topic of this video, which is how I-75 changed our culture without us even knowing it. So let's get started. How do you know you're on an interstate? Well, first, this may sound a little too elementary, but you gotta begin somewhere. There are signs that indicate that you're on an interstate, and those signs are called interstate markers. An interstate marker is red, white, and shaped like a blue shield. Oh, and it says interstate. Major interstates are given a 1 or 2-digit route number. The numbering system starts in the west, so interstates in the west have lower numbers. Odd numbers run north and south, while even numbers run east and west. But this is a little deceiving. Let's take, for example, Interstate 24. Yes, it does run north and south, but it also runs east and west, so it runs diagonally, and it was given an even number. Good old I-24 always being difficult. In some cases, you have bypasses or alternate routes around the interstates, but connecting further down the interstate, in which case a prefix number is added. So just to review, I-75 is a major interstate, and it runs north and south through 6 different states. The I is for interstate, the 7 refers to its geographic order from the west coast, and the 5 is an odd number indicating that it's a north-south interstate. Altogether, you get I-75. But let's say you're in Atlanta and you want to take the bypass. And let me add, if you're just driving through Atlanta, never take the bypass. But you'll notice that the bypass for Atlanta is 285 and not 275. So where did the 8 come from? Well, in this situation, bypass bypassing Atlanta means that you're temporarily leaving I-75 to connect with I-85, which is a different north-south interstate, only that you're not actually connecting with Interstate 85, but rather the Interstate 85 bypass of Atlanta. This is confusing for some motorists, and it's easy to understand why. If bypasses get you confused, let me help. See, there's no need for two bypasses in Atlanta. So instead of building a bypass using I-75, they built a bypass using Interstate 85. So notice the added prefix, which is 2 in this case, and as we mentioned earlier, you combine the 2 with the 85, and you get the Atlanta bypass, or 285. Listen, I really love Atlanta, I do, but I hate 285. It's always a non-stop traffic jam. Then there are mile markers that allow motorists to identify where they are on the interstate while in a particular state. For north and south interstates, mile markers begin on the southern border. For east and west interstates, mile markers begin on the western border.
When I was a kid, you would see these mile marker signs typically on the right-hand side of the road, but now they've moved them to the left-hand side of the road, and they're actually easier to see.
But interstates are different for more important and obvious reasons. Let's just face it, we could have named interstates after famous people in alphabetical order, and maybe it would have worked just fine. Confusing and controversial? Well, yes. And was that the best idea? Probably not. But the way we number our interstates is effective. It's not always perfect, but it works. Interstates are different because they are controlled access freeways designed for high-speed vehicular travel. Opposing directions of traffic are separated by a median, walls, or even a natural barrier, including land with flowers or even patches of trees. Often the terrain dictates how opposing lanes of traffic are to be separated. The point is that opposing lanes of traffic are always separated, and this reduces accidents drastically.
Interstates have 4 lanes at least, 2 going one direction, 2 going the other, separated by a median, and sometimes separated by a few hundred yards. Take, for example, Interstate 24 around Mont Eagle, or take Jellicoe Mountain in Tennessee, where the northbound lane and southbound lane completely separate.
On interstates, there are no traffic signals, intersections, or access to property. But like everything else in the universe, there are just a handful of exceptions. Do you happen to know any of those exceptions? If so, put it in the comments below. Those exceptions are extremely rare, but if you dig a little, you'll find them. Entrances and exits to interstates are provided at interchanges by ramps, which allow for speed changes between the interstate and other roads. In most cases, speed limits are a lot higher on interstates. I'll talk more about speed limits later.
Most exits off of I-75 are like this one here in Riceville, Tennessee. You know, you've got a gas station and a little hotel. Sometimes they're new hotels. But what I'm noticing is over the past 10 years and definitely going forward is that a lot of people are investing into these exits because so many people are traveling on I-75 these days that, hey, there's money to be made on the interstate on these exits. So you're seeing towns add exits to different parts of business area, but sometimes it's just to put up a few gas stations and a few hotels and get involved with the interstate business. And business on the interstate is good.
Believe it or not, the interstate system, including I-75, is relatively young. In fact, statistically, many of you were alive when interstates were being built across or up and down America. If you weren't alive, your parents or grandparents remember life before interstates, and that includes I-75. While interstates seem like a no-brainer these days, before the 1950s, the number of people driving and the number of cars on the road were increasing faster than people had time to consider interstates. But thankfully, government officials, civic and business leaders have been developing the plans to build interstates before the 1930s. The first push for interstates came during the Great Depression when President Roosevelt passed the Federal Aid Highway Act in 1938 to create jobs, and 40,000 miles of roads, including interstates, were promised, but only 6,500 miles were actually completed because funds for the project were diverted to the war effort. Many historians point to the Roosevelt administration for the first big push for a network of superhighways across America. And I guess you could look at it that way. But it's important to realize that the interstate system that was created is much different than what the Roosevelt administration envisioned. And there are 2 sides to that story, and I'll try to address those differences in a different way on a different video. But it's just too political for this video.
You know, when interstates were new, people really didn't like to travel on them. They were kind of scared of them. A lot of people avoided them. They were noisy, everything was fast, and it really scared a lot of people. But these days, because so many people use the interstate and they're comfortable with it, well, these days, I-75 adds lanes all the time. A lot of I-75 now is converting to 6 and 8 lanes just to be able to contain all the traffic.
But before lanes could be added and new interstates built, an economic depression had to end and a war had to be won. So after World War II came the baby boom and the Cold War with the former Soviet Union. I talk a lot about the Cold War in my videos, and there's a good reason. The Cold War affected Americans and the world far more than we realize, and I'm afraid that journalists today, regardless of your political affiliation or favorite news network, fail to remember life before the fall of the Soviet Union. So we get news out of context. During the Cold War, things were just different, to say the least. We won World War II, but we ended up with a new enemy, the Soviet Union. We had nuclear bombs, they had nuclear bombs, and America was different ideologically than the Soviet Union. They seemed to spread across the world, and yet we were spreading across the world. So it seemed inevitable that our two militaries were eventually going to clash. Seriously, back in the late 1940s and early 1950s, there were American generals and Soviet generals who believed that the country that struck first stood a better chance for survivors, and that either country should just go ahead and start a nuclear war and just get it over with, focus on rebuilding after the radiation settled. Thankfully, people who thought that way were never given the launch codes, and in my opinion, they should have never been given keys to a car. But in the mid-1950s, Americans began thinking about new reasons for interstates, mainly evacuating cities in the event of a nuclear war. The military was thinking about possible invasions and how to mass troops where we may need them as quickly as possible in case that Soviet invasion ever happened. Trains were considered the primary mode of moving troops and equipment, but there are only so many tracks. And yes, there were more than a few voices that supported the building of interstates for practical reasons like economic growth and product expansion. And there were other voices addressing the need for interstates so that large cities may be evacuated for environmental disasters like earthquakes or hurricanes.
Years and years ago, hitchhiking was a thing. Like, people hitchhiked to explore. It was sort of a modern way of hanging out on a railway car and not paying a ticket, I guess. Sort of bumming rides across the country to see the country. And different states have different laws on how hitchhiking works. But I don't recommend hitchhiking on I-75. I don't recommend it to anyone. It's dangerous and all kinds of terrible things can happen. But it is really interesting to me to find out how many people still actually thumb for a ride for joyous purposes, not because they're broken down or because of an emergency, but because they just want to see America and share a ride with somebody else. People still do that.
As soldiers returned home from World War II and got busy making up for lost time, they lived, loved, and worked. Suddenly we had a population explosion on our hands here in the U.S. They called it the baby boom, and it was indeed a boom. This baby boom meant more houses were being built, more cars coming off the assembly line, and new roads were being built everywhere. And oh yeah, women were working more than ever, and they weren't leaving the workforce anytime soon. So even though most families had only one car, most economists predicted the two-car household by the turn of the century. And they were right, but they were 20 years off in their prediction. Two-car homes were normalized by the 1970s, but the trend began taking shape in the 1960s. Homes built in the 1980s were more often than not including a two-car garage as a standard. So in the mid-1950s, the timing was perfect for an interstate system in America. In 1956, President Dwight Eisenhower and Congress came up with the National Interstate and Defense Highway Act, which was sort of like Roosevelt's Highway Act, only that Republicans were willing to spend a lot of money too. And no, I'm not being political, I'm just telling the truth. This was the biggest public works act in the nation's history, and without a doubt, it provides the biggest return. But cities all over America were already building roads known as expressways. Cities between two states like Cincinnati, Ohio and Covington, Kentucky were working out their own road network when the highway bill passed through Congress. The bill allowed each state more money to build roads in line with the vision of the U.S. interstate system. So I-75 in some cases was simply attached to projects already underway, and they were only altered. Often when you look at a map of I-75, you'll ask yourself, why did they design it that way? And even though it may not help your frustration, I offer you this. I-75 was conceived in the 1940s, designed in the early 1950s, improved, altered, and paid for in the late 1950s, and built in the 1960s and 70s. And each step along the way, the interstate was altered here and there, mostly around bigger cities. And this caused I-75 to stretch and pull to the east and west instead of making a nice straight line. It's hard to determine the exact cost of I-75 because much has been added and a lot more needs to be added. The federal government picks up most of the tab and the state a smaller portion of the cost. But the total price tag currently is somewhere around $200 billion. But again, that's not a good estimate. There are ongoing projects and on different parts of I-75 and additional projects planned, and some still in the think tank. So the cost will continue to rise, but so will the benefits. Here's what we know for a fact. Building I-75 was a long-term investment that's already proven its value. I-75 isn't the busiest interstate in the world. In fact, it's not even in the top 10, but traffic does back up pretty fast, and don't let anyone fool you. The fact that I-75 doesn't run in a straight line has a lot to do with traffic backing up, especially around Knoxville. But that statement is currently considered subjective and pretty much ignored. It does, however, frustrate a lot of common sense kind of people. In fact, a study was completed in 2002 that suggested an alternate interstate route to run parallel to I-75 from Chattanooga, Tennessee to Lexington, Kentucky. New technology would make it easier to negotiate the tall ridge lines that originally made the straight line too expensive. But that idea never got past the drawing board, mainly because the population on those ridge lines, which by the way happens to be the Cumberland Plateau, has increased significantly over the past 20 years. It's a pretty nice place to live. I-75 is still an amazing interstate, but it could be a lot better. And thankfully, people are always trying to make it better. Considering the amount of traffic that all of our interstates handle each second of the day, it's not surprising that interstates can be extremely dangerous. A recent study suggests that I-75 is the 5th most dangerous interstate in the U.S., and I'm not surprised. Insurance companies typically place the blame on drivers or the lack of law enforcement. I disagree completely. This is a serious and controversial subject and far from the scope of this video. In the near future, I want to create a serious video about why our interstates are so dangerous. Before I can make that video, I have to make sure that my facts are absolutely perfect. My eyes were open to a serious problem with all of our interstates, including I-75, about 25 years ago, when I witnessed one of the worst accidents in the history of I-75. It was December 11th, 1990. I was a junior in high school, and some friends and I were heading to an awesome cabin just outside of Riceville, Tennessee, but we got a late start. While crossing this bridge, we couldn't believe what we were seeing. It was late at night, and we should have only seen our headlights. Now, keep in mind, this was over 25 years ago, and back then, typically, you could just about park your car on this bridge for hours and never see any traffic. It's not like we were watching the news, even though this accident was so terrible that it was covered by every major news network at the time. But this was an age before cell phones and instant information. There were thousands of lights, making it appear as if it was the middle of the day. It was a 99-car pileup, and we showed up just a couple of hours after the event began. It looked like a war zone. Sadly, 12 people died, and 42 people were injured. No one knows the exact reason for the pileup other than the fact that the fog in the area reduces visibility considerably. And on that night, the fog was so thick that survivors of the pileup compare it to a blanket being placed over their windshield. In just a few moments, I'll explain how this terrible accident allowed for some major improvements to this part of I-75, and how I-75 has altered two entirely different regions of America. But first,
if you're a subscriber or a follower on VidMe, I just want to say welcome back. Thank you so much for following or subscribing to this channel and to all of our content, and I want to invite each and every one of you to join our new Facebook page. I'll put a link in the description, but it's really easy to remember. It's Bill Marion Life. That's Bill Marion Life, because life is good. So check us out on Facebook. Join our Facebook page. We've got a lot of events coming out, and we also have merchandise that we're ready to roll out here very soon. If you're new to A Nose for Life, I just want to say welcome, and I am so grateful that you're giving our content a chance. I hope you're enjoying this video, and I hope that you'll check out some of our other videos and that you'll consider subscribing. And by the way, you're invited to our Facebook page as well, Bill Marion Life. And by the way, we appreciate it if anyone hits that like button and shares the content that we share here on Facebook or on VidMe, because that helps our channel grow. We make content just for you, but we can't grow unless you help us grow. Again, thank you for watching, and more to come.
In 1993, just 2 years after the accident and after a very long investigation, the Tennessee Department of Transportation invested $4.4 million into that same stretch of interstate by adding fog detectors, gates, and warning signs. Since 1990, there have been no pileups in that area due to fog, and locals who use that stretch of I-75 to commute to Chattanooga or other cities feel safer knowing that the warning signs and gates are in use.
There have been some changes culturally too. When I was a kid, often on I-75 or any interstate, I-40, I-24, you would see people pull over the side of the road and maybe have a picnic or maybe use the bathroom. People don't really pee on the side of the road anymore. And again, I'm not trying to offend anybody with that. I'm just saying that over the years, I-75 has become a little more classy when it comes to urinating. You just don't see that now, but you used to.
I-75 connects some of the greatest cities in the United States. But the U.S. has changed quite a bit since 1977, when the majority of I-75 was complete. Michigan is the greatest example of the tremendous change that's taken place since 1977. When I-75 was still on the drawing board, Detroit, or Motor City, was the fourth largest city in the United States. But even by 1958, factories were beginning to shut down slowly. This was largely unnoticed at the time, and just a year later, Motown Records is born and begins cranking out hits. By the end of the 1960s, the city of Detroit is in decay, and riots break out all over the city. But it's not until the early 1970s that Detroit begins slipping noticeably as one of our nation's leading cities. Gasoline prices increase in 1973, and the public begins choosing fuel-efficient foreign-made cars. Detroit was never the same. There is a variety of reasons for the massive decline of Detroit. I have my opinions like everyone else connected to the Motor City, but if there's ever a city that proves the point of this video, it's Detroit. There have been several population migrations from the south to the north. I'm referring to Southerners moving north to Midwestern cities to find work. These migrations are a lot more complicated than your average history book can explain. No, not everyone simply picked up and moved north for a job on the assembly line. Northern migrations are a little more complicated than that. As one of my favorite YouTubers, Hank Green, says, the truth resists simplicity. Each migration was unique, but we do know that earlier migrations may have been a little more permanent, like when the assembly lines first opened in Michigan during the early days of the 1900s. Southerners who moved to the north to find work in prosperous Midwestern states may have stayed for many years or the duration of their lives, and many times disconnecting from their extended families and friends in the South altogether. At least by modern standards, which isn't really fair because by modern standards we're connected to people all over the world all the time. We know less about these earlier migrations than later migrations. The migrations tend to follow the car industry's need for labor, which makes sense, and it varied from decade to decade. But after World War II and during the baby boom, there was another migration, but this migration was very different. Roads connecting the North Midwest to the southern states had improved greatly even before the construction of I-75. For example, a family traveling from Corbin, Kentucky to Detroit could expect a 10-hour drive unless they had to stop and patch a tire, which was common, by the way. But during the late 1950s, solid wages and strong purchasing power made it possible for southern families who migrated north to stay connected to their families in the South for holidays, weddings, and funerals. It became common for families to visit over a 3-day weekend and even extended vacations. People from the rural South were then exposed to big cities, and people from the North were exposed to Southern food, and yes, even religion. Detroit had always been a melting pot for people from any background, but during the 1950s, more people migrated north for better wages, and they didn't necessarily feel culturally isolated from the South when they moved. Keep in mind that telephones were normalized by this point. Not to mention, they were only a 10 or 12-hour drive back to their extended families in the South. I'm using Detroit as an example, but this was the case in cities all across the North Midwest, and even more so after I-75. And by the time I-75 was complete all the way to Florida, a generation had passed, and a decade later, something new was taking place. By the 1980s, a slow migration was moving in the opposite direction, and I-75 made it easier to leave Michigan for warmer climates. The same men and women who migrated north in the 1950s or early to mid-1960s were either returning to their southern hometowns and bringing their retirement money with them or venturing farther south on I-75 to Florida. Either way, a lot of money was leaving Michigan during the worst possible time. This southward migration made a desperate situation in Detroit even worse. Over time, the migration out of Michigan increased exponentially, and it's still happening today. The situation in Detroit is much too complicated for this video, but it must be stated that Detroit, and to a lesser extent other Midwestern cities, had an enormous positive impact on southern cities and states over the past century. Modern southern industry owes a great deal to its North Midwestern neighbors. I'm a firm believer in Detroit and that this amazing city can make a remarkable rebound. If Detroit is to discover its greatness, I-75 will play a major role. These days, more and more people are traveling farther on I-75 to the northernmost parts of Michigan for great hunting, fishing, boating, and other outdoor activities. Oh, and not to mention cooler weather. Like I said earlier in the video, all interstates have traffic on both sides of the median. And for I-75, the movement of people from north to south or from south to north create cultural exchanges. These days, Northerners are not so disconnected from their southern neighbors. Many families in the north and south who live off of I-75 have relatives not far off an exit on 75, either north or southbound just a few hundred miles away. And thanks to social media, I-75 is taking more traffic during the holidays, not less. Sure, there is a southern migration from the north right now, but just wait, the pendulum will swing back the other way again. This movement of people north and south helps stop and expose racism in both regions. Stereotypes are reduced because of I-75, and music travels north and south on I-75, as there are quite a few country music stations in the north, and the Motown sound influences southern cities to this very day. Because of I-75, more people are exposed to different environments, altitudes, and attitudes with each passing mile. Northerners have access to southern sweet tea and biscuits and gravy, and those who live on the northern side of I-75 often remind we Southerners that 2 inches of snow isn't the end of the world as we know it. The letters I and Y are pronounced differently depending on where you live on I-75, that is, if they're pronounced at all, and occasionally everyone's ears are a little sensitive. And yet we understand each other, even if we don't speak the same English language. And sometimes we all agree politically, and sometimes we don't, but seldom, if ever, for the same reasons. And for the past 2 decades, I-75 has become a redistributor of wealth in many cases. But it's my hope that in the near future, I-75 becomes a corridor for financial wealth, health, and prosperity. Because over the last 50 years, people living near or close to I-75 have become one people of 6 states, learning to enjoy aspects of each other's new proximity and learning to appreciate our differences and similarities. U.S. Interstate 75 is one of the greatest interstates, not because I have facts or figures to prove it, but because I know people from both ends and the middle of I-75, and they're all different, unique, and amazing people with great families and friends. And I say this often, I will live wherever the good Lord wants me to live, but I am thankful for the many years I've spent living near I-75. Do you live near I-75? Let me know in the comments. I hope you enjoyed this very special edition of A Nose for Life. Be sure to hit the like button and share this video. I'm Bill Marion, and this is A Nose for Life. Be sure to check out these other videos.